Michael Carter should have been just another man walking through his town. But on that frozen morning in Rockford, Illinois, the blind Marine veteran and his loyal German shepherd, Rex, stepped into a storm of misunderstanding that would test not only their bond, but the conscience of an entire community. What began with whispers of suspicion soon spiraled into fear, anger, and a single reckless act that nearly cost them everything. Yet from tragedy rose a miracle, proof that loyalty and courage can outshine prejudice, and that sometimes God's hand moves through the loyalty of a dog to remind us we are never abandoned. This is not just a story of survival. It is a story of faith, redemption, and legacy. But what would you have done if it happened in your town? Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you believe loyalty still saves lives, and write Amen if your heart is ready for this journey. And don't forget, pour yourself a cup of ginger tea or coffee and come with us to the very end of this story. The morning snow fell in steady sheets, muffling the sounds of Rockford's Main Street beneath a cold, white silence. Cars crept cautiously along the icy road, their tires crunching against frozen slush, while pedestrians bent their heads against the wind, scarves pulled tightly around flushed faces. Amid this bleak winter scene, a lone figure moved with careful steps, his gait deliberate but strained, each motion betraying the effort it took to remain upright on the slick pavement. Michael Carter was 51 years old, a retired Marine who had once been known for his unshakable posture and commanding presence. Now, years after Afghanistan had stolen his sight with the sudden burst of an IED, he walked slowly, guided not by his own eyes, but by the steady pull of a harness in his left hand. His once square shoulders had softened slightly with time, though his build remained sturdy, the echo of decades of rigorous military discipline. A neatly trimmed beard framed his jaw, streaked with gray, and though his sightless eyes no longer focused, his face carried the rugged symmetry of a man who had lived both hardship and duty. He wore a dark wool coat that brushed his knees, a navy scarf tucked neatly beneath the collar, and his other hand tapped rhythmically with a white cane, striking the icy ground with small, purposeful clicks. Beside him padded Rex, a 7-year-old German shepherd with sable and black fur that gleamed even under the pale gray sky. Rex's body was muscular but lean, trained to precision, his posture alert yet fluid. He wore a navy vest embroidered with gold letters, "Service Dog, Do Not Distract." His ears twitched constantly, radar dishes swiveling to catch the subtle noises of the street. Occasionally he looked up at Michael, dark, intelligent eyes glinting with unspoken understanding, then pressed closer to his leg, as though reassuring both of them that no step would be misjudged. To passers-by, the scene was ambiguous. The snow made Michael's pace uneven, his cane tapping occasionally missing its rhythm as his boots slid against patches of ice. Some observers saw a blind veteran walking with quiet dignity. Others, less perceptive, saw only a staggering man leaning too heavily on a large, watchful dog, and their minds supplied a different story. An old drunk wandering through town with a pet too fierce to control. The murmurs began with a single woman clutching her purse tighter as she passed. "He looks unsteady," she whispered to her companion. A man waiting for a bus narrowed his eyes and muttered, "Guy like that shouldn't be out here if he can't handle himself." Another voice from behind added, "Dog's too big for him. Looks dangerous." Michael, though blind, could sense the shift in atmosphere. It wasn't sight that told him, but the sudden drop in conversation when he passed, the hiss of whispers cutting through the snowy air, The subtle quickening of footsteps behind him. Decades of training had honed his instincts to read the invisible currents of human behavior. His jaw tightened as he straightened his back, refusing to appear weak. Yet inside he felt the old familiar sting, an echo of those early months after his injury, when strangers had stared too long or spoken too loudly, as if blindness had made him less than a man. He remembered the explosion with the clarity of a nightmare, the roar of heat, the world going white, then silence followed by darkness that never lifted. But he also remembered Rex, then a much younger dog, trained in the military working dog program, pressing his warm body against Michael's chest in the rubble, guiding him even as medics carried them both away. It was that loyalty which had pulled Michael through rehabilitation, through months of stumbling attempts to remake his life without vision. And it was that loyalty which now anchored him against the icy whispers of Rockford's winter morning. As he reached the intersection near State Street, Michael paused, waiting for Rex's subtle signal to proceed. The German shepherd froze, body taut, nostrils flaring against the wind. A low rumble vibrated in his throat, not loud enough to draw attention, but enough to tell Michael that something was wrong. Michael's hand tightened on the harness. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice steady, but inwardly he felt a surge of unease. He had learned to trust Rex's instincts without question. If the dog sensed danger, it was real, even if unseen. From behind, footsteps grew louder, fast, purposeful, closing the distance. Michael turned his head slightly, trying to gauge direction by sound. His heart thudded painfully, memories overlaying reality. The hurried approach of enemy soldiers on dusty Afghan roads, the split second before chaos erupted. He inhaled deeply, forcing calm, telling himself this was just Rockford, Illinois, not Helmand Province. Yet the prickling at the back of his neck would not fade. Two men passed him on the right, their boots clattering against ice. One muttered, "What's he even doing out here in this weather?" The other snorted, "Probably drunk, letting that mutt drag him around." Michael's hands clenched, but he said nothing. Confrontation never helped, and he had long ago learned that silence preserved dignity better than futile arguments. Still, the words cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He wasn't drunk, he was surviving. He was trying, step by step, to prove that blindness had not stripped him of worth. Rex pressed against his leg, sensing his master's rising tension. The dog's ears, almost, were forward now, eyes locked on the movement of strangers, ready to intervene if the threat escalated. Michael exhaled, murmuring again, "We're okay, Rex." But the reassurance sounded hollow even to himself. As he prepared to cross, a voice called from the sidewalk ahead. "Hey, sir!" Michael turned his face toward it. The speaker was a man in his late 50s, bundled in a faded green parka, knit cap pulled low over thinning gray hair. His cheeks were ruddy from cold, and a cigarette dangled forgotten between his fingers. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing at Michael. "You all right? You need help?" His tone was ambiguous, part concern, part suspicion. Michael answered evenly, "I'm fine. My dog's trained for this." But the man's gaze lingered on Rex, whose powerful body and focused eyes could easily be misinterpreted as aggression rather than vigilance. "That animal looks ready to attack," the stranger muttered. "You sure you got him under control?" The words stung more than Michael wanted to admit. Control. It was what he feared losing most. Over his life. Over his independence. Over the respect of those who saw only disability. He tightened his grip on the harness. Rex stood steady, loyal, but the murmurs continued. A group of teenagers at the bus stop laughed openly now, one mimicking the shuffle of a blind man with exaggerated taps of an imaginary cane. Michael Chi heard it all, every note of mockery sharp against the brittle winter air. He pressed forward, willing himself not to falter. Yet each step seemed heavier, weighed down by the judgment of unseen eyes. Inside, a quiet anger flared, anger at the unfairness, at a world so quick to misinterpret what it did not understand. But beneath the anger lay something more dangerous: doubt. What if they were right? What if he looked pathetic, stumbling blindly through a snow-covered town with only a dog to save him from humiliation? At that thought, Rex nudged his leg firmly, grounding him back in the present. The dog's warmth was a reminder that he was not alone, that appearances did not define truth. Michael swallowed hard, pushing the doubt aside. "We've walked harder roads, buddy," he whispered. Still, the unease remained. He could not shake the sensation that this morning was different, heavier somehow, as though fate itself were pressing in from the shadows. The whispers, the laughter, the suspicion, they were more than passing annoyances. They were omens, warnings of something he could not yet see, but Rex had already begun to sense. And then, as he took the first cautious step into the crosswalk, Rex suddenly stopped dead, body rigid as stone. The leash trembled in Michael's grip. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, his entire frame quivering with focused intensity. Michael froze, breath caught in his chest. He could not see what loomed ahead, only feel the gathering tension, hear the sharp intake of the crowd around him, taste the metallic tang of fear rising unbidden in his mouth. The snow fell thicker, cloaking the town in a muffled silence. Somewhere in that silence, boots scraped against the pavement, drawing closer. Michael's pulse hammered. His mind whispered the same words it had whispered in Afghanistan before the disaster struck. Something's wrong. And on that frozen road in Rockford, with Rex locked in sudden, immovable alert, Michael knew with chilling certainty that this ordinary morning walk was about to veer into something far darker. The wind carried small crystals of snow like shards of glass down Rockford's main street, stinging exposed cheeks and noses. Michael Carter stood at the edge of the crosswalk, his gloved hand tightening on Rex's harness, the dog's body still rigid from the strange tension only he could sense. The murmurs from the crowd thickened. What had begun as whispers had grown into scattered voices, some mocking, some worried, others simply eager for drama. Phones were raised higher, their glowing screens framing the blind veteran and his watchful German shepherd as if they were part of a street performance. 2 blocks away, a patrol car rolled slowly through the intersection, its tires hissing against ice. Inside sat Officer Ryan Collins, 33 years old, his angular jaw set hard as he scanned the sidewalks for trouble. Collins was tall, over 6 feet, with a compact, muscular build that came from hours of gym training. His dark hair was shaved close at the sides, leaving a short crop on top that emphasized the sharpness of his features. Clean-shaven, he exuded the kind of discipline drilled into him by a father who had been a Marine drill sergeant. Yet there was something restless in his gray eyes, a tension that never seemed to ease. Collins carried a quiet bitterness, the residue of rejection. He had once applied for the Marine Corps himself, but had been disqualified after a routine physical discovered a congenital heart condition. That single word, unfit, had branded him, and though he had built a respectable career in the police force, a sense of inadequacy gnawed at him, especially in the presence of veterans. Beside him in the passenger seat sat Officer Maria Lopez, 39, with a face both kind and firm, framed by thick waves of black hair tied into a practical bun. Her olive skin bore the faintest freckles across the bridge of her nose, and her eyes, a deep warm brown, held a constant attentiveness. Lopez had been on the force for 15 years, known among colleagues for her patience and ability to de-escalate heated situations. Unlike Collins, she had no chip on her shoulder, but she carried scars of her own, memories of an older brother who returned from Iraq with PTSD and eventually took his own life. For her, every encounter with a veteran was laced with caution and empathy. Their radio crackled. Suspicious male, Maine and state, possibly intoxicated, accompanied by large aggressive dog. Caller reports erratic behavior. Collins straightened in his seat. "That's us," he muttered, pulling the cruiser toward the curb. Lopez's hand brushed the dash as she steadied herself. "Suspicious male? Or just someone different?" she murmured. But Collins was already unbuckling his seatbelt. As the officers stepped out, the crowd parted slightly, eager to see authority step into the scene. Michael turned his head toward the sudden crunch of boots on snow. Rex's growl deepened, his chest vibrating under Michael's hand. "Easy," Michael whispered, though his own heart rate spiked. Years of service had taught him to recognize the shift in a crowd's mood. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was fear waiting for confirmation. Collins strode forward, his gloved hands resting deliberately near his belt. "Sir," he called out, his voice clipped, "we've had reports of suspicious activity. I'm going to need you to stop right there." His tone was authoritative, almost hostile, a man asserting control before understanding the situation. Michael lifted his chin. "I'm already stopped. My name is Michael Carter. I'm blind. This is my service dog." He kept his voice calm, measured, the way he had learned to do in therapy sessions when explaining his condition to strangers. But he could sense Collins's skepticism in the long pause that followed. Lopez approached more carefully, her eyes softening as she took in the details. The white cane, the embroidered vest on Rex, the lines of strain etched into Michael's weathered face. "Sir," she said gently, "where are you headed this morning?" "To Veterans Corner Cafe," Michael replied. "Like I do every morning. The owner knows me." Collins's jaw clenched. "You got identification on you?" Michael nodded. "Left breast pocket. But you'll have to take it yourself. My hands are occupied." Rex pressed closer to his leg, sensing the rising tension. His ears flicked toward Collins, and his lip curled just slightly. Several people in the crowd gasped at the display, murmuring words like dangerous and aggressive. Phones tilted in for a closer view. Lopez noticed. "The dog's not attacking," she said firmly, shooting a glance at her partner. "He's alert because he's protecting his handler. That's normal for a service animal." Collins didn't respond. His gaze locked on Rex's bared teeth, his mind replaying memories of K-9 units he'd trained with that had once turned violent when poorly commanded. In truth, what he felt wasn't rational. It was the old resentment surfacing. Here was a veteran who carried himself with more quiet authority, even in blindness, than Collins had ever managed with perfect vision. And the dog, that magnificent animal, looked at him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Michael sensed the officer's hesitation. His voice sharpened. "Officer, my dog is not a threat. Please don't escalate this." The words "Don't escalate" were like a spark near dry powder. Collins's pride flared. He hated being told how to handle a scene, especially by a man he subconsciously measured himself against. His hand hovered closer to the taser at his belt. Lopez stepped between them subtly, her voice even. "Sir, we'll verify your ID. Just stay calm." She signaled discreetly for Collins to stand back, but he ignored the gesture, his jaw locked tight. The crowd buzzed louder now, the sense of spectacle heightening. Someone shouted, "He's blind! Leave him alone!" Another countered, "That dog looks ready to bite." The contradiction only fueled confusion. Michael's thoughts raced. He could feel the storm building. He remembered all too vividly what happened in Afghanistan, when signals were misread, when hesitation cost lives. He breathed slowly, fighting the rising panic, focusing on Rex's steady presence. But his fear wasn't for himself. It was for Rex. If they hurt his dog, the one being who had never failed him, Michael wasn't sure he could survive that loss. Lopez noticed the tremor in Michael's hand on the harness. She softened her tone. "Sir, I believe you. But you need to understand, people get nervous. They don't always see clearly what's happening." Michael's laugh was bitter. "That's the story of my life, officer. People seeing without really seeing." Rex gave a sharp bark then, his body angled toward an approaching figure. Another man had stepped closer from the crowd, phone raised high, narrating loudly for his live stream. "Blind guy with a vicious dog, cops moving in. Look at this, people, this is Rockford right now." His voice was thick with excitement, feeding off the tension. Michael gritted his teeth. "Is this what I am now? Entertainment?" The words came out raw, torn between fury and despair. Collins snapped, "Control your animal, sir, or I will." His hand gripped the taser fully now, thumb brushing the safety. Lopez's eyes widened. "Ryan, don't—" she began, but the warning was drowned out by the rising noise of the crowd. Michael's body stiffened. He could hear the crackle of electricity charging, smell the faint ozone in the freezing air. Rex snarled, muscles taut as steel cables, every instinct telling him his master was under threat. Michael's heart pounded as the realization struck. This situation was slipping beyond words, beyond reason. He opened his mouth to plead, but at that exact moment, Rex lunged a half-step forward, not attacking, but placing himself squarely between Michael and the officer. Collins's eyes widened at the motion, interpreting it as aggression. His finger tightened instinctively. The sound of the taser's capacitor whine rose in the frigid silence, piercing, imminent. The crowd gasped as one, and Michael's voice cracked out. "Don't, please. He's doing his job." And then the chapter ends, frozen in the breathless second before action. When one wrong move could change everything. Michael Carter felt the icy grip of panic tighten around his chest as the officer's sharp command echoed in his ears. The words, "Control your animal, sir, or I will," were not just present, but past, carrying with them the weight of shouted orders on desert battlefields. The frantic voices of comrades as dust and fire consumed everything around them. His knees weakened, not just from age or the slick sidewalk, but from the sudden torrent of memory. Afghanistan was no longer 5,000 miles away. It was here, bleeding into the snow-laden street of Rockford. His breathing quickened, shallow and ragged, as if he were back in Helmand Province, pinned down behind a crumbling wall while gunfire whined overhead. Rex pressed against him instantly, the German shepherd's body a barrier, his fur bristling along his spine. 7 years of training in both military and service roles guided the animal's instincts. Rex didn't lunge, didn't attack. He anchored. His low growl vibrated like thunder beneath Michael's palm, a sound meant less for aggression than for warning. The dog's eyes fixed on Collins, ears angled forward, every muscle coiled in defense of his handler. Collins, standing rigid with taser in hand, saw none of the nuance. To him, the massive dog was a threat ready to unleash, and the man behind him, a blind veteran claiming dignity, seemed like an unbearable affront. Collins's gray eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a hard line. The bitterness that had lived in him since his Marine rejection boiled up now, unfiltered. He didn't just see a man and his dog. He saw what he was denied: respect, sacrifice, and a quiet authority he could never emulate. His knuckles whitened around the taser grip. Maria Lopez stepped forward, her boots crunching on the snow, voice pitched low, steady, controlled. "Ryan, listen to me," she urged. Her hand reached subtly toward her partner's forearm, not to seize but to remind him of presence, of balance. "This isn't combat. This isn't an enemy. Look closer." But Collins's thoughts churned in dangerous loops. Look closer? That's what angered him most. Even blind, Michael Carter radiated something Collins had chased all his adult life: an aura of earned command. How could a man broken in body still stand taller in spirit than someone with 2 good eyes and a badge? The crowd around them hissed and whispered, feeding the storm. Some shouted for Collins to holster his weapon. Others yelled warnings about the dog, voices shrill with fear. Cell phones hovered higher. The theater of misunderstanding was building its audience. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears. He fought to center himself, to push away the ghosts clawing back from his memory. "Rex, steady," he whispered, his hand moving gently over the dog's head. The familiar shape grounded him, but inside the fracture widened. He heard the phantom voices of fallen comrades, the medic's cry, the phone explosion. His mind replayed the moment the blast stole his sight, the heat, the silence, and then Rex's bark echoing in the void. And then, without meaning to, words slipped from his mouth, fragile yet sharp. Colonel Davis would know how to stop this. The name hung in the air like a flare in the night. Collins's eyes sharpened immediately. "Colonel Davis?" he repeated, suspicion dripping from each syllable. "Who the hell is that? Some kind of handler? Or are you signaling to someone else?" His paranoia spiked, twisting the mention into conspiracy. Michael froze. He hadn't intended to say it aloud. The colonel's name was part memory, part talisman. Something he whispered in darker moments to remind himself he still had allies in uniform, men who had not forgotten him. But spoken here, in this charged moment, it sounded like code, like connection, like threat. Lopez frowned, glancing between them. "Ryan, it's probably just an old commanding officer," she said carefully, though even she couldn't help but wonder at the tension in Michael's tone. Collins stepped closer, eyes narrowing. Snow clung to the sharp lines of his jaw, and the faint scar along his chin, earned years ago in a bar fight he never spoke of, stood out pale against the flush of cold. "Tell me, Carter," he demanded, "what's Colonel Davis got to do with this? Who are you really?" Michael's chest tightened further. His voice, though shaking, remained calm. "I am who I said I am. Retired Marine, blind veteran. This dog is my service animal, Colonel Davis was, my CO. That's it. But the way his breath faltered, the way Rex's growl deepened at Collins's advance, only fueled suspicion. The crowd stirred, some whispering about conspiracies, others muttering about cover-ups. A man near the back shouted, "Maybe he's part of something." Collins's eyes flicked briefly toward the noise, then back to Michael. He was losing perspective, and Lopez knew it. She moved quickly, her tone harder now. "Ryan, stand down. You're projecting and you know it." Her words were sharp, cutting through his spiral, but Collins's jaw set stubbornly. Projecting? He drops a colonel's name like it's nothing. This doesn't smell right, Maria. I'm not backing off until I know what's going on. Rex stepped forward again, chest heaving, his frame towering between Michael and Collins. Michael gripped the harness desperately, whispering, "Easy, Rex. Easy, boy." But his voice cracked with stress. The fracture of memory and present was widening, threatening to consume him. For the briefest second, silence settled. Snowflakes swirled in the harsh winter air, the street lamps casting halos of dull light through the flurries. Collins's finger hovered closer to the taser trigger. Lopez's hand stayed poised to intervene. The crowd leaned forward, breath held. Then, from the far edge of the gathering, a voice rang out. Strong, female, authoritative. "Officers, what's happening here?" Heads turned. A new figure pushed through the crowd. Karen Mitchell, mid-40s, dressed in a thick beige coat and knit hat. Her auburn hair, streaked with gray, spilled from beneath the cap, and her pale face flushed from both cold and indignation. Karen was known locally as the chair of the Rockford Community Watch. She was tall, with a commanding presence, the kind of woman who looked directly into eyes and expected truth. Her personality was resolute. She had spent years advocating for safer streets after her husband was killed in a hit-and-run that police mishandled. Since then, she had become wary of law enforcement's mistakes, determined never to let blind trust override accountability. Karen's arrival shifted the balance instantly. Phones swiveled to capture her presence. Lopez exhaled in relief, but Collins bristled. Another voice of judgment was the last thing he wanted. Karen's eyes swept the scene, landing on Michael, then Rex, then the taser still crackling in Collins's grip. "That man is a veteran," she said loudly, so the crowd could hear. "Everyone in this town knows Michael Carter. He volunteers at the VA center every week, and that dog has saved lives more times than you can count. What in God's name are you doing?" The words cut sharp through the winter air. Collins's cheeks burned, but the suspicion in him flared brighter, defensive. "Then why," he shot back, "is he dropping names of colonels in public like it's some secret code? You ever ask yourself that, Ms. Mitchell?" Karen's lips thinned, her breath visible in the cold, as she answered. "Maybe because in times of fear, people reach for names they trust. You'd know that if you listened instead of threatened." The crowd rumbled approval, murmurs turning against Collins. Phones were aimed directly at him now, recording his every twitch. His jaw ticked, caught between pride and pressure. Michael stood silent, trembling slightly, caught between gratitude for Karen's defense and dread at how quickly the situation was spiraling. Rex's steady presence kept him grounded, but even the dog was reaching the edge of his restraint. And then Collins did something that froze the entire street. He stepped closer, voice low but audible. Or maybe Carter's not who he says he is. Maybe this Colonel Davis is pulling strings behind the curtain. Maybe this whole thing is a setup. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lopez's eyes widened, horrified at the words. Michael stiffened, his heart hammering. The name, the suspicion, the crowd, all colliding. Rex barked sharply, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cold air. And just as the moment seemed ready to break, the distant sound of heavy engines rumbled faintly from beyond the snowy streets, too deep to be ordinary traffic. The crowd turned, phones rising higher, faces pale with confusion. Michael's breath caught. Rex's ears pivoted toward the sound. Collins glanced over his shoulder, suspicion written into every line of his jaw. The engines grew louder, closer. And the chapter ends there, with everyone frozen in anticipation, waiting to see what force was coming down Rockford's winter road. The heavy rumble of engines still echoed faintly in the distance, vibrating against the cold walls of Rockford's Main Street. The crowd murmured nervously, their phones raised high as if capturing the sound itself. Michael Carter stood frozen, his hand gripping Rex's harness so tightly his knuckles ached. Rex remained tense, hackles raised, every breath puffing clouds into the icy air. Collins still held his taser in a rigid stance, while Lopez hovered beside him, torn between restraint and the urge to wrest the weapon from his hand. Karen Mitchell's voice had momentarily shifted the crowd, but the atmosphere remained charged, ready to shatter at the smallest spark. Then, pushing through the spectators with a determined energy, came Ethan Brooks. He was 36, tall and lean with a wiry build that suggested both nervous energy and a life spent on the move. His brown hair was unkempt beneath a beanie, a few strands falling across a pale forehead. His face was angular, sharp cheekboned, with a pair of restless green eyes that missed nothing, always darting from one subject to the next. His scruffy beard and thin lips gave him an intensity that could easily be mistaken for arrogance, though in truth it came from deep-seated distrust rather than ego. Ethan carried a smartphone mounted on a stabilizer rig, the red recording light glowing as he streamed live to an unseen audience. His coat was dark, worn at the elbows, and his boots were scuffed from miles of chasing stories across back streets and town halls. Ethan was a freelance journalist, one who had carved out a reputation for hunting down stories that painted institutions in their worst light. The root of his crusade was no mystery. His father, a quiet factory worker, had been killed years earlier during a chaotic encounter with police officers who misidentified him as a suspect. Ethan, only a teenager then, had watched the case dissolve without accountability, leaving his family shattered. Since that day, his distrust of authority had hardened into mission. Every flashing badge or uniform was, in his eyes, a potential aggressor hiding behind procedure. He lifted his camera high now, his voice rising above the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are watching this unfold live in Rockford. A blind veteran, a decorated Marine, threatened in broad daylight by the very officers sworn to protect him." The crowd stirred at his framing, some nodding, some shaking their heads, but all feeding into the rising tension. Michael turned his face toward the new voice. He couldn't see, but the tone cut into him with a sharpness he disliked. It wasn't defense. It was exploitation, twisting truth into spectacle. "I don't need this," he muttered under his breath. But Ethan pressed closer, narrating every move. "See the dog? See how they claim he's aggressive? Look at him, protecting his master with loyalty, while the state points a weapon at them both." Collins's face darkened, the vein at his temple pulsing. "Put that phone away," he barked. Ethan only angled the lens closer. "Why? So the truth disappears? People deserve to see how you treat your own citizens." Lopez winced. This was spiraling faster than even she could manage. She knew Ethan Brooks by reputation. He had confronted officers before, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, but always with a camera and a firebrand's voice. She could see the danger. His words weren't just describing, they were shaping perception, pulling the crowd further from reason. Michael shifted uneasily, the memories still burning at the edges of his mind. He wanted to correct Ethan, to stop the narrative from spiraling into fiction, but fear kept him still. The word unstable whispered through the crowd now, muttered by those who mistrusted his rigid posture, his trembling hands. Ethan, without meaning to, was feeding that image. His tone grew louder, more dramatic. And look, listen carefully, folks. This man just invoked the name of a colonel. Colonel Davis, ask yourselves why. Ask yourselves what's hidden here. Because this is bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The name, repeated publicly, stung Michael like a blade. His head lowered slightly, his breath visible in the cold. He hadn't wanted Davis's name out here, twisted by strangers. The colonel was a lifeline, a piece of the past that grounded him. Now it was becoming a conspiracy tool. Karen Mitchell stepped toward Ethan, her tall frame imposing even against the restless journalist. "You're not helping," she said sharply, her voice cut with the authority of someone used to commanding rooms. "You want views, fine, but this is a man's life, not your stage." Ethan's eyes flared. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the stage is already here. The police made it when they pulled weapons on a blind veteran. I'm just making sure the country sees it." Lopez interjected, her voice firmer now. "Mr. Brooks, you need to step back. You're inflaming an already volatile scene." But Ethan refused, his streaming phone still centered. If the truth inflames, then maybe the truth needed fire. The crowd swelled louder, pulled between compassion and doubt. Some were moved by Ethan's rhetoric, others unsettled by the insinuations. A woman in a red scarf whispered loudly, "He seems unstable, just like the reporter says." Another man countered, "He's a vet. He's earned better than this." The split widened, every word driving the knife of division deeper. Michael stood trembling, overwhelmed by the storm around him. The voices, the accusations, the colonel's name echoing, it all felt too much. Rex nudged against him, the steady heartbeat of loyalty against chaos. Yet even Rex's presence couldn't erase the gnawing dread building in Michael's chest. He was losing control of the story, of himself. Collins saw his trembling as confirmation of guilt. His jaw tightened, his taser hand still ready. "You see that?" he hissed to Lopez. "He's cracking. Something's off." Lopez glared at him. "What I see is a man under siege, Ryan, and we're the ones cornering him." Before Collins could respond, the distant engines roared louder, unmistakable now. Heavy diesel, rhythmic, disciplined. The crowd shifted nervously, some craning necks, others stepping back. The sound of military-grade vehicles rolling over ice was not something this small town heard often. Ethan swung his camera toward the sound, his eyes wide with excitement. "And here it comes, folks. Proof that this is bigger than we thought." His voice trembled not with fear, but with adrenaline, the thrill of capturing history in real time. Michael stiffened, his heart leaping painfully. He knew that sound, every gear shift etched into his bones. Rex's ears pointed forward, his body pressed close, vibrating with anticipation. Snowflakes thickened, falling like ash as the first dark silhouette of a vehicle appeared at the far end of the street. Lights dim, but presence undeniable. The crowd gasped, phones jerking to capture the sight. Collins blinked, his grip faltering for the first time. Lopez whispered under her breath, "Dear God." Karen Mitchell folded her arms, her expression unreadable. The engines grew louder, closer, echoing off the buildings until every window rattled. The tension snapped taut. And then, just as the first armored vehicle loomed into clearer view through the curtain of snow, the live stream in Ethan's hand glitched, freezing mid-frame. His audience lost their window. Ethan cursed, fumbling with the device. The crowd leaned forward, desperate for clarity. Michael's lips moved soundlessly, forming a single name. Rex whined softly, eyes locked on the approaching shadows. And the chapter ends there. The convoy still hidden in snow's veil, leaving everyone to wonder whether salvation or damnation was rolling into Rockford. The snow seemed to freeze in midair, each flake suspended like glass shards as the sharp crackle of the taser split the street. Michael Carter's body arched violently, his blind eyes widening in instinctive terror, though they could no longer see. His cane clattered against the icy pavement, the sound drowned out by Rex's agonized yelp. The German shepherd convulsed, his thick coat spiking with static as the current surged through him. Together, man and dog collapsed into the snow, limbs twitching, their bond momentarily severed by pain. The crowd gasped as one, the silence of shock breaking into chaos. Shouts rang out, curses directed at the officers, cries for someone to stop what had already happened. A woman near the front sobbed openly, clutching her child against her chest, as if shielding him from a world gone suddenly cruel. Officer Ryan Collins stood frozen, taser still extended, the twin wires quivering in the wind. His square jaw, normally clenched in defiance, slackened now with disbelief at his own action. Collins was 33, broad-shouldered, his short blonde hair barely visible under his winter cap. His features, rugged and hard-lined, carried the perpetual strain of a man who lived in the shadow of his own failure. That failure had been stamped years earlier, when a routine medical examination revealed a hidden heart arrhythmia, disqualifying him from the Marine Corps. The dream of following his father and grandfather into military service evaporated in a single word: disqualified. Since then, bitterness had grown inside him like frost on glass, invisible at first, then creeping into every corner until it defined him. To Collins, every veteran was a reminder of what he could never be. And now, staring at the disabled Marine writhing at his feet, he felt both triumph and horror twist inside his gut. Beside him, Officer Maria Lopez reacted instantly. She was in her late 20s, her frame lean but strong, wrapped in a dark police parka. Her black hair was tied back in a no-nonsense bun, her sharp brown eyes scanning the scene with practiced urgency. Lopez was the daughter of immigrants, raised in a crowded Chicago apartment where discipline and loyalty meant survival. She had chosen law enforcement not for power, but to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And right now, every fiber of her being screamed that Collins had become the danger. "What the hell have you done?" she shouted, rushing past him to kneel beside Michael. She yanked her radio to her mouth. "Dispatch, this is Officer Lopez. Urgent medical response at Main and State. Civilian and K9 down. Taser discharge." Michael lay twitching, his breaths shallow, the snow beneath him melting into a cold slush that soaked his shirt. His hand scrambled blindly until it found Rex's heaving flank. Even through the tremors, the bond was unbroken. "Help! My dog!" he gasped, his voice raw, blood trickling from where he had bitten his tongue. Rex whimpered, his body convulsing less now, but still stiff with residual current. His brown eyes fluttered open, searching for his master, though Michael could not return the gaze. The dog pressed weakly against Michael's side, his loyalty stronger than his pain. Ethan Brooks's live stream trembled as he realized his own voice had fueled the fire. The journalist's hands, normally steady when chasing chaos, shook as he held the phone. His pale face had drained of color, and sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the winter air. He had wanted exposure, accountability, to show the public the truth of abuse. But he hadn't wanted this. Hadn't wanted to be complicit in a moment where a blind veteran and his dog collapsed under electricity. He muttered into the stream, his tone cracking. "You're watching this live. Oh God. They tased him. They tased the dog. This is beyond anything." His green eyes darted to Michael's body, then to Collins, then back to the camera, each flicker betraying his panic. The crowd erupted into fury now. A man in a camouflage jacket, his beard frosted with snow, stepped forward shouting, "That's assault! He's a veteran!" A teenage girl near him screamed, "I got it on video! He's blind, you idiots!" The words bounced through the crowd, multiplying like sparks in dry tinder. Collins finally lowered his taser, his breathing ragged. His pride, his festering resentment, had carried him to this moment. But now reality crashed down. The sight of Michael's crumpled figure seared into him. He stammered, He wouldn't control the dog. Protocol." But even his voice faltered under the weight of dozens of recording phones capturing every syllable. His blue eyes, usually cold, flickered with something new. Fear. Lopez ignored him, her gloved hand pressed against Michael's chest, checking for rhythm. "Stay with me, sir," she urged, her tone steady though her pulse raced. She turned her head sharply toward Collins. "Call EMTs now!" Collins didn't move. His boots felt cemented to the snow. It was Lopez who shoved him, breaking his paralysis. "Do it, Ryan, or I swear—" He fumbled for his radio, his voice cracking as he relayed the request. "Officer-involved incident. Medical needed immediately." The words sounded hollow, detached, as if uttered by someone else. Karen Mitchell, the tall teacher who had earlier defended Michael, pushed through the crowd again. Her red scarf whipped in the wind as her stern voice carried. "He's not unstable. He's blind. He told you. And you just electrocuted him like he's nothing." Her dark eyes blazed with indignation. She dropped to her knees opposite Lopez, brushing snow from Michael's face, speaking gently. "Hold on, sir. Help is coming." Michael's mind swirled between past and present, the shock dragging him into memories of Afghanistan, the roar of helicopters, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the sudden silence that followed the explosion that had stolen his sight. Now the taser's crackle had been enough to send him back there, lost in the battlefield of memory. His lips moved around words not fully formed. "Colonel, Davis, code." The fragments slipped into the air, half conscious, but they carried weight. Lopez leaned closer, frowning. "What did you say? Colonel who?" Ethan caught it, his journalist instincts kicking despite his turmoil. He pointed his camera closer. "He said Davis. Colonel Davis. You all heard it." Collins's eyes snapped toward Michael. That name again. He clenched his jaw, suspicion flaring even through his guilt. A secret colonel, code words. It fed the paranoia he had carried for years about shadow programs he would never be part of. The sound of sirens cut through the freezing air, approaching fast. Red and blue lights flickered against the snowbanks at the far end of the street. EMTs were coming, but the distant rumble of engines still echoed behind them. Heavier, deeper, distinctly military. The crowd shifted uneasily, some looking toward the sirens, others toward the darker sound approaching from the opposite direction. Phones pivoted. Voices overlapped. Speculation roared like a wave. "Ambulance!" someone shouted. "No, listen, those are Humvees," another countered. Lopez tightened her grip on Michael's coat, focusing on his shallow breathing. "Stay with us, sir. You're going to make it." Michael's hand clutched Rex's fur with desperate strength, his lips forming one last whisper. "Don't take him." Then Rex, as if understanding, pressed his muzzle against Michael's chest, letting out a low growl. Not aggressive, but protective. A declaration to the world that separation would not be allowed. And in that moment, as EMT sirens drew close and the thunder of military vehicles neared, the scene fractured into two possible futures. One of rescue, one of escalation. The chapter ends there, the decision suspended in the frozen breath of Rockford's winter. The wail of the ambulance siren faded beneath the heavier thunder of engines that belonged not to rescue vehicles, but to machines of war. Snow swirled like powder across Main Street as 3 Humvees rolled into view, followed by 2 matte black SUVs with government plates. Their presence cut the town's winter silence into fragments, sending ripples of fear and awe through the gathered crowd. People instinctively stepped back, their phones trembling as they continued recording, unwilling to miss the spectacle that would soon be streamed across the nation. Michael Carter lay in the snow, his breath shallow, his gloved fingers still curled around Rex's fur. The German shepherd, shaking off the effects of the taser, pressed closer to his master's side, protective even in weakness. Michael's lips moved faintly, the words barely audible. "Code Bravo, Colonel Davis." It was the invocation of a bond forged in deserts far from Illinois, and it had summoned something few in Rockford had ever seen. From the lead Humvee, a tall figure emerged. Colonel Richard Davis, 60, carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of command. His hair, once black, had faded to a steel gray that glinted silver under the winter sun. Deep lines etched his face, each one a testament to years of battlefield decisions that weighed heavily on a conscience rarely allowed rest. His square jaw, clean-shaven, and his piercing blue eyes gave him an aura that demanded silence without a single word spoken. Davis wore his dress uniform beneath a heavy military overcoat, and the rows of ribbons across his chest caught the eyes of even the most skeptical bystanders. Davis had been Michael's commanding officer in Afghanistan, the man whose decisions had saved men at the cost of his own sleep. He had seen Michael walk into fire and refuse to leave until the last of his unit was safe. He had seen Rex, then just a military K-9, throw himself between enemy fire and his handler. Davis never forgot. When the program ended and Michael was retired into darkness, Davis had promised him one thing: "If the world turns against you, you call me, and I will come." Now, stepping into Rockford's snowy street, Davis made good on that promise. He scanned the scene with cold precision. His eyes swept past the flashing phones, the ambulance caught in traffic behind the armored line, and landed on the officers still standing in shock. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the weight of authority forged in battle. "You tased Sergeant Michael Carter," he said, every syllable measured. "And you struck down Sergeant Rex, his decorated service animal. Do you even understand who lies in the snow before you? The crowd fell into silence so complete that even the snow seemed to hush. Officer Maria Lopez lowered her gaze, guilt and relief warring in her chest. She had tried to stop Collins, but she had not been fast enough. Now her career, her oath, felt stained. Officer Ryan Collins, however, bristled. His pride, already cracked, shattered further as the colonel's words exposed his crime before hundreds of eyes. Collins's blonde hair was damp with sweat despite the cold. His jaw clenched hard enough to ache. The colonel's disdain struck him harder than any disciplinary hearing could. To be chastised by a man he had once dreamed of serving under. It gnawed at the bitterness that had lived in him since the word disqualified had defined his life. Ethan Brooks, still streaming, felt his knees weaken. The colonel's arrival reframed everything he had said only minutes before. He had called Michael unstable, had shaped the narrative as if the veteran were dangerous. But the truth was being unveiled in front of him, and his viewers were already commenting furiously. You lied to us, Ethan. This man's a hero, not a threat. You should apologize. His green eyes flickered with dread as he realized his voice had not only failed Michael, but had condemned himself. Colonel Davis strode past the officers without pause, kneeling beside Michael. The veteran's pale face tilted upward, unseeing eyes searching for familiarity. Sir, Michael whispered, his breath catching in disbelief. A firm hand gripped his shoulder. Easy, Carter. You're not alone. You never were. Rex stirred, pushing his head weakly into Davis's other hand, recognizing the scent and steadiness. The colonel allowed a rare softness in his expression. Still fighting, aren't you, soldier? Good boy. Two medics from the convoy appeared, efficient and calm. One of them, Staff Sergeant Daniel Reed, was a barrel-chested man in his late 30s with dark stubble and a scar running across his left cheek, the kind that told stories without words. Reed had served as a combat medic in Iraq, and his steady brown eyes revealed someone who had seen panic and learned to cut through it. He knelt quickly, assessing Michael's vitals, his gloved hands firm but gentle. Pulse rapid but steady. Taser effects fading. We need to move him and the dog together. Davis nodded. No separation. They stay as one. The crowd erupted in applause, a cathartic release of their fear and anger. A woman near the front shouted, "That's right! He's a hero!" The chant began to spread, half relief, half fury at what had been done. Collins stepped forward, trying to salvage authority. Colonel, with respect, this is a police matter. He resisted. Davis's gaze pinned him, sharp as a blade. You dare speak of respect after striking down a man who gave more for this country than you will in your lifetime? Sergeant Carter saved an entire platoon during an ambush. Rex here took a sniper's bullet meant for him. Do you call that resistance? Collins faltered. His words caught in his throat. The cameras recorded every second, the colonel's rebuke echoing into history. Lopez spoke up then, her voice trembling, but clear. Colonel Davis, I tried to stop him. I didn't want this. Please believe me. Her dark eyes searched his, desperate for absolution. For a moment, Davis studied her, weighing her words against her expression. He gave a curt nod. Then you will testify, and the truth will stand. Ethan swallowed hard, lowering his camera slightly. The colonel's words rang in his ears, each one dismantling the version of events he had built for thousands watching online. For the first time in his career, he wondered if he had become the villain in his own story. Michael stirred, clutching at Davis's sleeve with surprising strength. "Don't let them take Rex," he murmured. "You have my word," Davis replied firmly. He stood, signaling his men. Soldiers moved with mechanical precision, forming a perimeter that pushed the crowd back and left no room for interference. Snow continued to fall, heavier now, blurring edges and muffling sound. Yet the moment's clarity was undeniable. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The police, once in control, now looked small against the wall of uniforms and rifles. Still, tension lingered. Collins's face burned red with humiliation, his chest heaving. Ethan's live stream caught every detail, broadcasting not only the colonel's authority, but the officer's unraveling pride. The crowd's jeers rose again, louder this time. And then, from the second SUV, another figure emerged. A woman in her mid-40s, sharp features framed by auburn hair, tied in a neat chignon, wearing a long black coat that contrasted starkly against the snow. Her heels clicked deliberately on the pavement, her presence almost as commanding as Davis's. Margaret Shaw, federal liaison for the Department of Veterans Affairs, was known in Washington for her relentless efficiency and razor-sharp tongue. Her pale skin and calculating gray eyes gave her a reputation. The kind of woman who brokered deals behind closed doors, who never wasted words but ensured every syllable carried weight. She approached Davis with brisk steps, her voice cutting the air. "Colonel, command authorized this intervention, but you know as well as I do, this isn't over. Media are circling like vultures. Every second here is becoming national news." Davis didn't flinch. "Then let the country see what loyalty looks like." Shaw's gaze flicked to Collins and Lopez, then to Ethan with his still recording phone. Her lips tightened. "Or let them see a scandal unravel in real time." The cliffhanger hung there, the winter street caught between honor and chaos, the crowd divided between hope and dread. The blizzard had quieted to a light snowfall by the time the military convoy reached the gates of the Rockford Regional Military Medical Center, a facility most townsfolk had not even known existed. Hidden in plain sight near the outskirts of town, the low, fortress-like building was blanketed in white, its floodlights carving sharp beams into the darkness. Inside one of the armored SUVs, Michael Carter sat slumped against the seat, his breathing steadier now but still shallow. Rex lay across his legs, the German shepherd's weight heavy but reassuring. Michael's blind eyes were closed, but his hand never left Rex's fur. Colonel Richard Davis sat across from him, his posture stiff even in transit. The lines on his face deepened under the harsh cabin light, reflecting not just authority, but the fatigue of a man who had spent his life holding others together. Every so often, his gaze flicked to Michael, as if checking silently that the man was still tethered to this world. As they arrived, military medics rushed to open the doors. Dr. Elaine Parker, chief physician at the center, greeted them immediately. She was in her early 50s, a tall woman with a wiry build that gave her movements an efficient precision. Her short-cropped silver hair framed a face carved by long nights and countless crises. Her pale skin carried faint lines of exhaustion, but her sharp gray eyes were unwavering, the kind that could unnerve even the most stubborn soldier. Compassion and command lived side by side in her demeanor. "Bring him inside," she ordered crisply. "And don't separate the dog. They stay together." Michael stirred at her voice. "Promise me." "Rex," Dr. Parker knelt briefly, placing a hand on Rex's flank. "He's part of this patient. I understand." Her tone was firm, soothing. It anchored Michael in the present. Hours passed in a blur of examinations. electrocardiograms, neurological tests, blood work, all conducted while Rex remained close, sometimes lying beside Michael's bed, sometimes lifting his head when unfamiliar hands approached. Nurses were careful, respectful of the bond. One of them, Nurse Kelly Ramirez, only 24, petite with dark curls escaping her bun, whispered as she inserted an IV, "He's brave. You both are." Her warm brown eyes, lit with admiration, reminded Michael of his niece Lily, though he kept that thought to himself. Rex, though shaken, recovered faster. The veterinarians confirmed no permanent damage, only muscle tremors and stress. They placed him on a padded mat near Michael's bed, administering fluids. When Michael reached out, Rex pressed his muzzle against his hand with the same old loyalty, reassuring his handler without words. Outside the facility, however, words were everywhere. Ethan Brooks sat alone in a corner of the press tent, erected across the street. His once fiery voice had dulled to something quieter, guilt pressing on his lean frame like an extra coat of snow. His restless green eyes, once sharp with suspicion, now reflected regret. He tapped at his laptop, drafting his first of what would become a series of articles. "I was wrong," he typed, his fingers trembling. "I misjudged him, and in doing so I misled you. Michael Carter is not unstable. He is the very definition of service and loyalty." His confession, streamed online within hours, spread across the country faster than his earlier live stream. Viewers who had condemned Michael now condemned the system that had failed him. Collins, meanwhile, sat in silence at the Rockford precinct, stripped of his badge, the suspension immediate. His blonde hair was disheveled, his blue eyes bloodshot. He stared at his reflection in the interrogation mirror, haunted not just by what he had done but by the truth Colonel Davis had thrown at him, that he had seen a hero and chosen to see a threat. For the first time he felt the full weight of his resentment. For the Marines who had accepted others. For the arrhythmia that had ended his dream. For himself. His career was over, but what unsettled him most was knowing his actions had nearly ended a man's life. Officer Maria Lopez, on the other hand, found herself thrust into an unexpected spotlight. Her attempt to de-escalate, captured on dozens of phones, was praised in national coverage. She remained modest, insisting in interviews, "I just did what any decent officer should have done." Yet in quiet moments, she stared at the ceiling of her apartment, dark hair spread against the pillow, and wondered if she could ever truly separate herself from the stain of that day. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's condition improved. The tremors subsided, the headaches dulled, and slowly he regained enough strength to walk the sterile halls with Rex guiding him. Dr. Parker's sharp eyes softened each time she saw him make another lap, his cane tapping in rhythm with Rex's paws. It was Margaret Shaw, the federal liaison, who returned weeks later to deliver the news. She arrived at the medical center in her black coat, her auburn hair pinned back neatly, her gray eyes sharper than ever. "The bill has cleared committee," she announced. "They're calling it the Carter-Rex Act. National protections for service dogs and stricter training for officers regarding disabled veterans. Congress will move fast. Your story made sure of it." Michael's blind eyes turned slightly toward the sound of her voice. He smiled faintly. "I didn't want to be anyone's symbol." Shaw tilted her head, her tone softening for once. "Heroes rarely do." The culmination came on a bright winter morning, weeks after the incident, when Rockford gathered in its town square. Snow had been cleared to make way for a stage, where the mayor, the press, veterans, and townsfolk assembled. Michael, wearing a navy coat, stood tall with Rex at his side. The German shepherd wore a new vest, embroidered with gold. Letters. Service dog. Carter Rex Act. The crowd roared when the mayor pinned a medal on Rex's vest, the Oak Ridge Medal of Valor. The dog's ears flicked, tail thumping, as if he understood the moment. Michael reached down, his blind eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and whispered, "You've always been the real hero." Among the crowd stood Ethan, his camera lowered, no longer seeking spectacle but truth. Lopez watched too, her expression somber yet proud. Even Collins was there, in plain clothes at the edge, his face lined with shame, yet unable to look away from the man he had wronged. As applause echoed, Michael gripped Rex's harness and stepped forward to the microphone. His voice, steady though quiet, carried across the square. "We survived because we stayed together. My dog and I walked into tragedy. But today, we walk out with a legacy. Let it be a reminder. Loyalty, whether from a soldier, a dog, or a community, is what makes us whole." The crowd erupted again, and for a moment, Rockford was unified. Yet behind the cheers, Ethan noticed Margaret Shaw whispering to Davis, her gray eyes calculating. He couldn't hear, but her expression was serious, almost grim. The story wasn't over. Something larger was in motion, hidden in the fine print of legislation and the shadows of Washington. And as snow began to fall again, soft but unrelenting, Michael Carter gripped Rex's harness tighter, unaware that while his legacy had begun, a new storm was gathering just beyond the horizon.